Let's talk about how neurons communicate with one another. Before you watch this video, you should have already looked at the basic neurophysiology PowerPoint. I'm assuming you know the basic terminology and stuff from that. We're going to try to remind you, but watch that first, okay? So this is my pathetic attempt to render a neuron on the board, okay? Let's look at what the parts are. So these things up here, these are the dendrites, okay? Remember, dendrites. This is basically the input part of the neuron, or one of the input parts. So this is where the neuron listens to its friends in order to find out what it should do. Remember, neurons can really only make one decision. Either they fire an action potential or they don't. Either you sneeze or you don't. Either you have an orgasm or you don't. You can't have 1/3 of an orgasm. Neurons can't have 1/3 of an action potential. Either they fire an action potential or they don't. How do they decide whether to fire one? By listening to their friends. They say on average each central nervous system neuron is connected to or communicates with like 1,000 other neurons, okay? So it's listening to 1,000 of its friends give it advice, either saying, yes, fire the action potential, or no, don't do that. So those are the dendrites. This is the axon, this is the output, all right? So dendrites are input, that's where the signals come in. Axon is output. So this is where the signal goes out. Output, this is where the action potential will go. Now, where does the neuron actually make the decision? In this little place right here called the axon hillock. Hillock means a little hill. So notice the axon gets wider here where it joins the cell body. So this is the axon hillock, okay? Down here we have the axon terminals, all right, the ends of the axon terminals, terminal, the end, like the bus station, the terminal. And then these are the synaptic knobs, okay? Synaptic knobs, synaptic end bulbs, the terminal bouton. And so what does a neuron do then? If it decides to fire an action potential, all right, listens to its friends, makes a decision, the axon hillock. If it fires an action potential, then the action potential goes down the axon, continues down the axon terminals, and what happens when it gets to the ends of the axon terminals? It causes the release of neurotransmitters, all right? And that's the same thing that was happening here. Neurotransmitters are being released onto the dendrites. That's how it was getting the signals from its friends. So, I'm going to draw something right now, and you be thinking about what it is that I'm drawing as I'm drawing it. I'm going to get rid of some of these labels because they're just going to clutter things up. So, what is it exactly that I'm drawing when I'm doing this, all right? You should be able to figure this out. Think about this. What am I doing here? What am I drawing? What are these things? This whole diagram looks kind of like one of those 1950s sci-fi movies. The thing that ate Cleveland. All right. So what are those things that I was drawing? These are synaptic knobs from other neurons. They're coming in and releasing neurotransmitters onto the dendrites, okay? These are from other different neurons, some of the 1,000, right? I said the 1,000 other neurons. Well, on the board I can't draw 1,000, so I've only drawn, a dozen or whatever, okay? But that's what's going on. So these are synaptic knobs and axon terminals for other neurons. They're releasing neurotransmitters, and that's telling this neuron whether or not, yes, you should, or no, you shouldn't fire an action potential. So how can some of them say yes and others say no? Well, let's zoom in. Remember the place where these come together, this is a synapse. Remember? We saw at the neuromuscular junction, that was a synapse. Let's zoom in on a synapse, and we got two different possibilities here, okay? Let's take a look. So we've seen this before. We saw this at the neuromuscular junction. When the action potential comes down the axon terminal, all right, it causes the exocytosis of neurotransmitter, all right? So neurotransmitters now diffuse across the synaptic cleft, all right? And remember, they bind to receptors, all right? They bind to the receptors. So what happens when they bind to the receptors? What happened at the neuromuscular junction? Remember, the receptor was actually an ion channel. And so it actually opened a channel. Now, at the neuromuscular junction, what kind of channel was it? It was a sodium channel. So in this case, here is a sodium channel, all right? Notice sodium is positively charged. So what happens is when the neurotransmitters open the ion channel, lots of little positive sodiums are going to flow through the channel, and they're then going to flow down the dendrite, okay? We call this an excitatory postsynaptic potential, an EPSP. Excitatory because it's going to increase the probability that this neuron sends out its own action potential. Postsynaptic because it's on this side of the synapse. Up here is the presynaptic side, down here is the postsynaptic side. And potential refers to electricity, all right? So an excitatory postsynaptic potential. Sodium ions flow through the opened ion channel that was opened by the neurotransmitters, creates a positive current. This is electricity, damn it. This is real electricity, okay? So that's an EPSP, increases the likelihood of an action potential. Well, that's at some synapses. Other synapses, instead, it's chloride. These are chloride channels rather than sodium channels. So in this case, when the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor, all these little negative chlorides can flow through the open channel, and then they flow along the dendrite. We call these IPSPs, inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. These are going to make it less likely for the axon, for the neuron, to send out its own action potential. By the way, both of these together are called graded potentials. Why are they called graded? Because they can vary in size. They can be big ones or they can be small ones. What causes a big one versus a small one? The amount of neurotransmitter released, all right? A lot of neurotransmitter creates a big graded potential. What causes more neurotransmitter? Basically the strength of the stimulus, all right? If somebody gives me a little tap like that, small amount of neurotransmitter. On the other hand, if somebody goes, that would be a lot of neurotransmitter. That's going to create a big graded potential, okay? So what I'm going to do now is we're going to pause the video here because my camera will automatically break the video if I go too long and erase it in weird places. So this is going to be the end of part one. Make sure that you're solid with this, okay? So again, we've got a neuron. It's making a decision here in the axon hillock. How is it making the decision? Well, some of its friends are saying, yes, fire an action potential. Other friends are saying, no, don't, all right? And it has to do with the type of ion flowing through the open channel. We'll be back for part two.